At 7 a.m., a man could be seen running, having just completed a 10 kilometers run. From then until noon, he practiced kendo, delivering 500 head strikes to a dummy. By 5 p.m., he headed to the gym for body training under the guidance of an instructor. His workout for the day consisted of 3 major exercises: bench press, squat, and deadlift, each performed for 10 sets of 10 repetitions. Committed to repeating this routine for 14 consecutive days, the man had already submitted his resignation letter to his workplace, deciding to leave his job to fully focus on his regimen. The man recalled someone once asking if he had suddenly gone crazy for resigning from his job just to train his body. Upon hearing this, he wondered that perhaps being crazy might have been the better option. As he pondered this, a system screen unexpectedly appeared before him. The system informed him that the door to the end of days was about to open, and that only 5 seconds remained until the apocalypse. It warned him to prepare for the impending catastrophe, providing him with quests to strengthen himself in order to face the coming disaster. As time ticked down, the timer hit 0, and the end of days finally descended upon the world. 15 days ago, everyone received an urgent message on their phones, warning of a critical disaster. Monsters had appeared near Inwang Mountain. Citizens in the surrounding area were instructed to evacuate immediately to avoid encountering the creatures. Confusion spread as people read the message, with many assuming it was a prank. Just then, a live video from a reporter appeared, confirming to everyone that the monsters were real and the situation was no joke. The reporter, addressing everyone watching his live video, said that since he had come all the way to the scene, he should get a little closer to the monster for a better look. However, at that moment, viewers began spamming the chat, warning him that the monster was right behind him. The reporter dismissed the warnings, believing they were joking, since he had just checked and the monster hadn't moved. But in the next instant, the monster suddenly appeared behind him and killed him on the spot. The reporter's scream startled a man named Lee Ho-young, who was watching the broadcast. As Lee Ho-young walked, he couldn't help but be surprised by how realistic the video looked. Throughout the day, everyone had been receiving disaster alert messages, and he wondered what was really going on. He thought to himself that life was already hard enough without the sudden talk of monsters. Lee wasn't about to believe something so far-fetched. With so many fake videos circulating lately, he was convinced this was just another hoax. But as he looked ahead, he was shocked to see a monster lying on the ground right in front of him. Lee wondered why there was an injured monster lying on the ground in front of him. It was unsettling, and fear crept over him, so he decided to run. Trying to ignore the wounded creature, Lee loudly made an excuse, saying, "I need to get home early, today's the day my math teacher is coming." As he turned to leave, the monster tried to stop him, looking at him with an innocent expression and asking for help. Lee hesitated, realizing the monster was indeed asking for his assistance, but despite its attempt to appear cute, the creature was still far too terrifying for Lee to handle. Lee thought to himself that he was human, while the creature before him was a monster. He wasn't the type of person kind enough to show compassion to a monster, even if it looked at him with innocent eyes. He reasoned that he couldn't help it, no matter how pitiful it seemed. But just then, the monster pulled out a picture of its family, sobbing and gesturing that it wanted to return to them. Seeing this, Lee's resolve faltered, and he couldn't hold back any longer. Despite his earlier reluctance, he decided to help the monster. Later, after assisting the creature, Lee returned home. At that moment, the system notified him that he had received a silver goblin's pill. The system hinted that consuming the pill would grant him something secret and valuable. Lee couldn't believe what had just happened. He had helped a monster and, on top of that, received a gift from it. It didn't seem like something a monster would do, and it left him questioning whether it was truly a monster at all. Curious about the gift, the mysterious pill, Lee also began to wonder about the strange system that kept appearing in front of him. Thinking it might be a hologram, he reached out to touch it. As his thoughts drifted to the pill, he wondered what would happen if he consumed it. Just then, an urgent news broadcast appeared on TV. The reporter announced that large, mysterious buildings had suddenly appeared all over the world. The reporter described them as towers and mentioned that they had lost contact with the U.S. Army, which had entered one of the structures. Upon hearing the news, Lee was stunned by the appearance of both monsters and unknown towers. He wondered if the apocalypse had truly begun. As he held the pill in his hand, an explosion suddenly shook the area outside his house. People were screaming, fleeing in panic from the source of the commotion. Then, everyone stopped in their tracks, frozen in shock as a massive tower emerged out of nowhere. At that moment, the news reporter announced that a huge tower had also appeared in Korea. Lee, seeing the tower so close to his home, clenched his fist. Without hesitation, he decided to consume the pill given to him by the monster. Lee wasn't sure if the decision he was about to make was the right one, but this was his only chance to do something as crazy as consuming a pill from a monster. In that moment of uncertainty, he swallowed the pill. Instantly, a massive surge of power coursed through his body. The system appeared again, informing him that he had unlocked the Sage status window, which would give him the highest chance of survival in the current situation. Just then, particles resembling pieces of a puzzle began to gather and form a glowing, radiant book. Lee, still in shock, reached out his hand. To his surprise, he found himself holding the luminous book. As soon as Lee opened the book, a brilliant light erupted from its pages. The system reappeared, informing him that the door to the end of days was about to open, with only 15 days, 4 hours, and 12 minutes remaining. It urged Lee to prepare for the impending catastrophe and recommended that he begin training his body. At that moment, the system presented Lee with a quest that included strength training, cardio exercises, and learning kendo, tasks he needed to complete in the time leading up to the end of days. At that moment, Lee decided to heed the system's instructions. Time passed, and he committed himself to the guide's recommendations. He gave up everything else and devoted the next 15 days solely to training. As the countdown ended, the door of the end opened. Upon seeing the system notification, Lee was surprised. It was quite different from what he had imagined. Suddenly, a blunt sword materialized in front of him, leaving him astonished. The system then announced that the game had officially begun and that it was now time for the tutorial. It also informed Lee that the aptitude test had been completed, and based on its data analysis, he would be assigned the most suitable class for his abilities. The system then announced that Lee had been assigned the class of combat swordsmanship. He was taken aback to receive such a class. Following this, the system instructed him to open his status window for more details. However, when Lee opened it, he was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information that popped up. There was too much to read at once. As he scanned the status window, he noticed that he was a level 1 swordsman and had a level 1 skill in basic swordsmanship. The status window also displayed his stats: stamina, strength, agility, and sensitivity, all at low levels since he was just starting out at level 1. Lee stood up, picked up his sword, and felt a surge of excitement at being designated a combat swordsman. He realized that this was the moment when everything would truly begin. At that moment, the system displayed a list of objectives he needed to complete. He had to choose at least one of the two options presented. The first was to survive in the forest he was currently in for 60 minutes, and the second was to find the exit and escape. Lee thought to himself that if this was meant to be a tutorial, it should provide him with time to adjust to the game before things really started. Lee then opened the guidebook in his system, which informed him that he needed to use the full 60 minutes of the tutorial to defeat as many monsters as possible. The guidebook also noted that choosing the second option, finding the exit, would hinder his growth and was therefore not recommended. Lee was surprised to discover that he could access the Sage status window during the tutorial as well. At that moment, he realized that the Sage status window had prompted him to exercise because it anticipated that situations like this would arise. Based on the guide's advice, Lee realized he had to hunt the monsters in the vicinity, so he decided it would be best not to run away from the forest. Just then, the system announced that the tutorial had officially begun, and at that moment, a small monster appeared in front of him. Lee was taken aback. The creature was a level 1 one-horned raccoon and surprisingly cuter than he had expected a monster to be. However, in an instant, the raccoon transformed, displaying a vicious expression as it lunged at Lee. Reacting swiftly, Lee slashed the monster effortlessly, dispatching it without any difficulty. At that moment, the system announced that Lee had successfully killed the one-horned raccoon and gained experience for his effort. Since the monster had fallen to a single strike from his basic swordsmanship, Lee concluded that it was very weak, just a typical tutorial monster. He noticed that using his basic swordsmanship had consumed 2 magic power points. With only 10 magic power available, this meant he could only use the technique 5 more times. Realizing this, Lee understood that he needed to conserve as much magic power as possible while hunting for monsters. As Lee continued to defeat numerous monsters, he finally leveled up to level 2. Not only that, but he also regained his health and magic power with the level increase. The system then informed him that he would earn points each time he leveled up, which he could use to enhance his stats. Excited by this revelation, Lee felt grateful for the level up, especially since his magic power was nearly depleted. However, just as he was reveling in his progress, Lee noticed something strange: the system was beginning to fade away. In that moment, the system explained that because he possessed the Sage's status window, he would level up more slowly compared to other players. Lee was left feeling both puzzled and intrigued by this new information. Lee was taken aback by this revelation, realizing that there was a penalty associated with having the Sage's status window. He couldn't believe that the level he had just gained came at such a cost, and he began to wonder when he would be able to level up again. Frustrated by what he perceived as an absurd handicap, Lee decided to call upon his status window to display his stats. However, upon examining the information presented, he was puzzled by what he saw. Something felt off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with his stats. Upon examining his stats, Lee was surprised to find that he still had points available. At that moment, he thought to himself that if his assumptions were correct, this wasn't a penalty at all. Rather, it was an overpowered, bug-like ability. Although he had fallen back to level 1 as expected, his remaining points continued to increase. Lee realized that the more he leveled up, the more experience he would need for the next level. He concluded that raising his stats this way would be easier than leveling up through normal means. Determined, he decided to focus on enhancing his stats. As he looked at the options available to him, he saw that he had 4 choices to make. Lee considered that boosting his strength and agility would be the best choices for a combat swordsman. Strength would enable stronger attacks, while agility would enhance his speed and reflexes. However, he realized that the stat he needed most at that moment was sensitivity, so he decided to allocate points to increase that stat. As he continued to defeat the one-horned raccoons, Lee reflected that the monsters in the vicinity were relatively weak, merely tutorial monsters. He was able to defeat them easily with his default stats. The challenge, however, was that finding enough one-horned raccoons within the given time limit would be difficult, limiting his opportunities to further increase his stats. This was why Lee had chosen to level up his sensitivity stat, and as a result, it had become much easier for him to locate the raccoons now that his sensitivity was heightened. Just as he was contemplating his situation, a system notification popped up, informing him that he had defeated all the monsters in the area, which activated a hidden quest. At that moment, a massive level 2 monster, identified as the one-horned raccoon Alpha, appeared behind him, glaring at Lee with vicious anger. Lee, taken aback, wondered what kind of formidable creature stood before him. At that moment, the one-horned raccoon Alpha launched itself at Lee with a powerful attack, but he barely managed to dodge it. Lee noted the monster's impressive speed and began to wonder if it was the boss of the tutorial. He took a moment to calm himself and assess the situation. Upon closer inspection, Lee realized that this monster was distinctly different from the other one-horned raccoons he had fought and defeated. While he acknowledged that the Alpha was indeed more powerful than its predecessors, he also understood that defeating it was still within his reach. Determined, Lee prepared to confront the formidable creature before him. After a few moments, the system notified Lee that he had successfully defeated the one-horned raccoon Alpha. Not only had he completed the hidden quest, but he had also received gold as a reward. The system then confirmed that Lee had officially finished the tutorial. Reflecting on the experience, Lee thought to himself how unexpectedly long the 1-hour tutorial had felt, though he was relieved that it was finally over. However, as he opened his eyes, Lee was stunned to find himself in an entirely different place. To his shock, he was now standing among a group of other people, unsure of where he was or what would happen next. At that moment, a booming announcement congratulated everyone present for successfully completing the tutorial. The announcement went on to explain that they were now in the lobby of the tower, located in the C-2567 region. Lee felt confused by the mention of a lobby and wondered what it could mean. As he took in his surroundings, he noticed 14 men and 11 women nearby. Curiosity sparked within him. He began to wonder if they had also completed the same tutorial and had been transported here just like him. Lee observed the situation and noticed that most of the people around him were in a state of panic. He thought it was understandable. After all, the entire world had changed in just a day. Reflecting on the chaos, he realized that if he hadn't known beforehand about the impending apocalypse, he too would likely be caught up in the fear. Determined to stay composed, Lee reminded himself that he needed to focus on surviving this ordeal. Just then, a woman spoke up, asking where they were. Before anyone could respond, a small figure approached and explained that they were in the tower known as the Tower of the End. As the woman looked down, she was taken aback to see a talking rabbit answering her question. The rabbit introduced itself, stating that its name was Kumkum and that it was the manager of the lower floor of the tower. Everyone gasped in disbelief, bombarding it with questions about how it had appeared out of nowhere. Some wondered if it was a child in a rabbit suit, while others asked if it was responsible for bringing everyone to the tower. Kumkum sighed, thinking to itself that such reactions were entirely normal for newcomers. Amid the commotion, Lee stepped forward and addressed Kumkum directly, expressing his desire to know one thing. If this was truly the end of the world, what were all the people supposed to do now? Kumkum, hearing Lee's question, nodded and replied that it was indeed an excellent inquiry. Kumkum then smiled menacingly and informed everyone present that all 22 players in the lobby of the tower would be participating in a life-or-death game. The gravity of Kumkum's words sent shockwaves through the crowd, leaving everyone stunned at the realization that their lives were at stake. Kumkum continued, explaining that all humans on Earth were currently within the tower and that they would need to work together for each mission and floor they aimed to climb. Hearing this, Lee raised his hand and asked Kumkum if they would be able to return to their normal lives once they reached the top of the tower. Kumkum, with a playful grin, replied that it, too, had no idea what would happen when they finally made it to the top. Upon hearing Kumkum's response, Lee asked what the purpose of climbing the tower was. Kumkum replied that there was no need to search for meaning in such matters, Lee simply had to do what he was told. The rabbit ominously added that only death awaited those who refused to climb the tower, mentioning that a significant number of people had already perished during the tutorials. At that moment, panic washed over Lee as he realized the grim reality of the situation. He had not considered that people could actually die, and even though it was just a tutorial, he knew there were many who might have struggled to complete it. At that moment, Kumkum spoke up, asking if anyone was willing to try and kill him, explaining that his death was necessary for them to return home. He added that those who assisted him would receive a special reward. The announcement left everyone shocked and confused, while Lee couldn't shake the feeling that it might be a trap. Kumkum didn't seem very strong, but Lee quickly realized that there was no way he could defeat a creature that was level 55. Deciding it was best to stay back and observe for now, Lee hesitated. Just then, the system notification popped up, instructing him that he needed to help Kumkum, the lower floor manager, get home. Lee contemplated how he would assist Kumkum in reaching home and whether it was acceptable to attack him. Although he had always found it beneficial to heed the guide's advice, Lee wondered if it was worth engaging in something so suspicious. Confusion washed over him as he struggled to decide on a course of action. Just then, one of the other participants stepped forward, declaring his willingness to help Kumkum reach home. With a smile, the man told Kumkum that if it wanted to die so badly, he would gladly oblige. Lee realized he was too late to offer his assistance, watching as the man brandished his sword, warning Kumkum not to regret it, promising to deliver a painful death. Just as the man was about to swing his sword at Kumkum, the rabbit's expression shifted dramatically. In an instant, Kumkum delivered a powerful blow to the man's head, severing it from his body and sending it flying backward. The gruesome scene left everyone in shock, paralyzed by fear. Kumkum, now wearing a sinister grin, remarked that it had been an accidental counterattack. The other participants screamed in terror, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Lee stood frozen, too frightened to move, realizing that he could have met the same fate had he offered to help Kumkum with his request. Kumkum, trying to regain control of the situation, insisted that the earlier incident had been a mistake and asked for another volunteer. However, no one believed him. Panic-stricken, they scattered away from the rabbit in fear. Lee found himself questioning whether the guide had deceived him. Kumkum extended his hand once more, pleading for someone to help him return home, but the gruesome display had left everyone unwilling to step forward. In that moment of uncertainty, Lee wondered why the guide would mislead him. He decided to consult the guidebook again and discovered another ability he possessed: the Sage's Eyes, in addition to the Sage's status window. This ability would allow him to trigger the Sage status window and view the status of other players, providing valuable insight into their abilities and intentions. Lee wondered why another ability had appeared alongside the Sage's status window and where it had come from. Curious, he activated his Sage's Eyes on Kumkum. A smile crept across his face as he realized how to assist Kumkum with its request. As Kumkum continued to plead for help, Lee stepped forward, declaring his willingness to aid the creature. In that moment, he felt reassured that the guide hadn't misled him after all. Kumkum looked at him, noting his low level, and remarked on it. But Lee quickly interrupted, insisting that level didn't matter when he was about to perform a good deed. Kumkum, grinning menacingly, acknowledged Lee's words, agreeing that he was indeed correct. Kumkum urged Lee to send him home quickly. Just as Lee was about to draw his sword, a woman interrupted him, cautioning that it was too dangerous, especially after witnessing someone die moments earlier while trying to fulfill Kumkum's request. The others chimed in, agreeing with her and urging Lee not to act recklessly. However, Lee interrupted them, assuring them it was fine because he had a plan for the situation. He promised that they were about to witness something exciting. Confusion spread among the crowd as they wondered what kind of plan Lee had in mind. At that moment, Kumkum charged at Lee, but Lee remained calm and unafraid. As he stood his ground, he realized something strange about Kumkum's earlier statement. Lee was certain there had been 25 people in the lobby, yet Kumkum announced that only 24 players would participate in the game with their lives on the line. Initially, Lee considered the possibility of a mistake, but then he dismissed that idea. It became clear to him that this was a test, a way for the others to confront their fear of facing a level 55 monster and the very real threat of death. Kumkum's mention of the wrong number was intentional. There had only been 24 players in the lobby to begin with, and the person who had just died was merely a hologram. At that moment, everyone was shocked when Kumkum delivered a powerful blow to Lee. However, Lee remained unfazed. He realized that not only was the man who had just died a hologram, but Kumkum was also merely a hologram, which meant it had no actual attack power. This revelation came to Lee when he used his Sage's Eye skill to examine Kumkum's stats, confirming that it posed no real threat. Kumkum, realizing that Lee had figured everything out, acknowledged him with a nod of respect. "You're quite perceptive," he said. "For those like you, who possess courage, may the odds be ever in your favor." With that, Kumkum vanished into thin air, leaving the players in a state of awe. Upon Kumkum's disappearance, it dropped a reward for Lee, a green ball pill, onto the ground. In that moment, everyone realized that Kumkum had been just a hologram all along. Someone then asked Lee how he had figured out that Kumkum was a fake. Lee explained that he had coincidentally noticed that the blood had passed right through Chai Yizal, the woman who had earlier warned him about Kumkum. He went on to say that, given her proximity to the person who had just been killed by Kumkum, her face and clothes should have been covered in blood. This made Lee suspect that everything was just an illusion. Upon hearing this, Chai Yizal touched her face and realized that Lee was right. There wasn't a single drop of blood on her. At that moment, a huge man named Kim Seong, who was level 4, stepped forward and approached Lee. Seong told him that it would be a huge waste for Lee to keep the reward dropped by Kumkum. He remarked that Lee had just been lucky to figure it out and added that if he had noticed earlier, he would have done the same thing Lee had. Curious, Lee asked Seong what he meant by saying it would be a waste for him. Seong then explained that the fact Lee was still only level 1, even after completing the tutorial, meant he was either incredibly weak or unable to kill anything. He suggested that Lee had likely passed the tutorial by simply running away rather than fighting. Seong then added that Lee was going to die soon anyway, so for the sake of mankind, he he was giving Li the chance to yield the reward and hand it over to him. Li, shocked by Seong's arrogance, couldn't believe he was serious. In that moment, Li made a decision. Right in front of Seong, he used the reward and gained a stat point. Seong was stunned, unable to believe that Li had blatantly defied him. Li then calmly told Seong that yielding wasn't something he did, and he had no intention of ever yielding to him. Furious, Seong stated that Li was just a bottom feeder, accusing him of acting this way only to save face because he was still just a lowly level 1. In that moment, Li thought to himself that, based on his experience, the wisest course of action would be to avoid people like Seong. However, he wondered how long he could keep that up. Just then, an announcement rang out, informing everyone that their starting gold would now be distributed. They were told that they could use the gold in the shop, and in addition to the base amount, extra gold would be awarded based on the number of monsters each person had killed during the tutorial. The announcement also mentioned that the highest amount of starting gold earned by a player in their area was 7,400 gold. Everyone was shocked to hear that someone among them was going to receive 7,400 gold. Seong, irritated by the announcement, regretted not performing better in the tutorial and killing more monsters. Another person, Kim Junsung, remarked that while he didn't know who had come in first, whoever it was must have been incredible. No one knew who had come in first, except for one person, Li himself, who had earned the 7,400 gold for killing the most monsters in the tutorial. Li decided to keep this fact to himself, knowing that revealing it would only attract more trouble. After all, Seong was already envious over a single stat point. As Li opened the shop, he reflected on the 3 ways the gold could be used. First, to buy items. Second, to level up skills. And third, to increase one's stats. At that moment, Li invested half of his gold into leveling up his stats, raising his strength, stamina, agility, and sensitivity to 20 points each. While Li focused on his shop, Seong was fuming, frustrated by the high cost of leveling up skills. Noticing Seong's irritation, Li decided to upgrade his own basic swordsmanship, spending 1,500 gold on it. He also bought new clothes, as he didn't want to keep wearing his gym uniform. Just then, Chai Yizal approached Li and said she wanted some advice from him. Surprised, Li asked why she would seek advice from someone like him, who was still just level 1. Yizal responded by telling Li that she didn't care about his level, but was instead impressed by his bravery. Li was taken aback by her unexpected compliment. Curious, he used his skills to check Yisol's stats. After looking them over, Li asked her how much gold she had. Yizal replied that she currently had 800 gold. When Li heard Yisol's response, he thought to himself that she was being honest, as she hadn't lied about how much gold she had. At that moment, he decided to hide the fact that he was using a cheat key. Changing the subject, Li asked Yizal if she liked exercising, to which she replied that she didn't mind walking. Li then remarked that, in that case, her stamina was probably not very strong. Yizal agreed with his observation. Li advised her to focus on improving her stamina first, explaining that without it, she wouldn't be able to use items effectively, no matter how much gold she spent. Feeling motivated, Yizal thanked Li for his advice and said she would follow his suggestion. At that moment, another announcement echoed, stating that the first floor mission would commence soon. Players were advised to form their own 3-person parties, and those without parties would be randomly assigned to one. They had 3 minutes to make their decisions. Hearing this, Li realized that while he had anticipated a group mission, he hadn't expected it to come so soon. Junsung then spoke up, suggesting that since they could see each other's levels, everyone should also share their classes. Following his lead, the players began to reveal their classes, and soon teams started forming as individuals chose whom they wanted to party up with. At that moment, Yizal asked Li if he would be willing to team up with her for the upcoming group mission. With that, Yizal became Li's first party member. He had no reason to refuse, especially since having a healer like Yizal on his team was a significant advantage. However, the others were not as accommodating. One by one, they rejected Li's proposal to form a group. Li couldn't help but think that, despite having a healer, they might have been deterred by his status as a level 1 player. He realized it was understandable that no one else wanted to join their team. After all, a level 1 combat swordsman wasn't exactly an appealing choice. Lee noticed that the players had already started forming teams with others at the same level, and as he observed them, he realized that the only people left without a team were the very ones he wanted to avoid. After a few moments, an announcement rang out, stating that the 3-minute period had ended and that incomplete parties would now be filled randomly. It also mentioned that the first floor mission was about to begin. Seong, now forced to be in a group with Lee and Yizal, grumbled that he was very unlucky to be teamed up with a bottom feeder like Lee. Lee couldn't help but think that he wasn't thrilled about partnering with Seong either, but he never imagined that Seong was even more unpopular than he was, despite being a level 4 player. Seong, looking at Lee with an irritated expression, snapped, asking what Lee was staring at and telling him to go away. Hearing this, Lee wondered if it would even be possible for him to cooperate with Seong. However, he resolved to make it work, telling himself that he needed to find a way to collaborate with Seong in order to survive in the tower. Just then, the system notification appeared, announcing that their mission was to annihilate the Kobold tribe and that they had 12 hours to complete it. As the three of them roamed the forest, they finally came across the Kobold tribe's base. Seong glanced at Lee and declared that he would wipe out the Kobold tribe, instructing Lee not to get in his way. In response, Lee reminded Seong that this was a team mission, not a solo endeavor. Seong's anger flared, and he called Lee a loser, insisting that Lee was merely riding on his coattails and had no right to comment on the situation. Lee sighed and retorted that he would indeed try to ride on Seong's coattails and see just how good that was. Lee decided to listen to Seong for the time being. Seong remarked that Lee had intended to ride on his coattails from the very beginning, questioning why Lee was acting so defiantly. He added that Lee should only get his act together when someone was about to kill him. In response, Lee sarcastically thanked Seong for his concern. Meanwhile, Yizal looked worried, wondering if their party would be able to hold it together. As they approached the Kobold tribe's base, Seong complained about the abundance of bugs in the area, while Lee, irritated by Seong's behavior, thought to himself that they needed to complete the mission without any further complications. As they walked, Lee looked up and noticed the abundance of bugs around them, realizing that being in the mountains meant they could expect a lot of them. At that moment, Yizal called out to Lee, asking if the kobold monsters were strong. Lee replied that they might be stronger than the one-horned raccoon, but since they were still at level 1, defeating the kobolds should be manageable. He also cautioned Yizal to remain on guard, reminding her that they were in the Tower of the End, where anything could happen. Yizal nodded in agreement, acknowledging the validity of Lee's warning. As they approached a kobold, Lee noticed it was level 5 and observed its muscular build from top to bottom. He was surprised. This kobold was vastly different from the previous monsters they had faced in the tutorial. Yizal also spotted the kobold and remarked that it was clearly stronger than the other monsters, asking Lee what they should do in this situation. Lee suggested they check their surroundings first, as there might be more kobolds hiding nearby. However, just as he was speaking, Seong stepped out into the open, accusing Lee of hiding instead of confronting the monsters. He charged at the kobold and delivered a powerful blow to its head. Lee and Yizal were shocked to see Seong step out into the open and confront the kobold directly without any plan. While Seong's blow did connect, it failed to inflict significant damage on the creature, which glared at him with fury. Undeterred, Seong launched a flurry of attacks against the kobold. Lee couldn't believe Seong would charge in and fight the monster so recklessly. He hadn't expected Seong to be this stubborn. As Lee pondered the situation, Yizal announced that she would also help Seong by healing him during the fight. Lee felt a sense of relief that no other kobolds were nearby, otherwise, they could have been in serious trouble. As Lee observed the fight between Seong and the kobold, he recognized that Seong was putting his level to good use. With Yisol's healing support, Seong might even be able to defeat the kobold on his own. However, Lee was surprised at how low the damage from Seong's attacks was compared to his strength, leading him to wonder if the kobold had some hidden weakness. He decided to consult his guidebook for assistance. Upon checking, he discovered that kobolds were passive monsters and would only attack when provoked. Reading this, Lee realized that Seong had stirred the hornet's nest for no reason. Trying to focus on the positives, Li thought that capturing a few kobolds for research purposes was still worthwhile, so their confrontation wasn't entirely unproductive. Just then, as he continued to flip through the guidebook, he stumbled upon information that could aid them in their fight against the kobold. At that moment, Seong activated his level 1 skill, Stone Fist, and aimed a punch at the kobold. However, he missed and instead struck a nearby tree, which broke and fell right on the head of another kobold, this one level 6 and stronger than the one Seong was currently fighting. Regret washed over Seong as he realized the consequences of his actions. As the newly angered kobold charged at him, he felt a wave of panic. He was about to be in serious trouble. Turning to Li for help, Seong was frustrated to find that Li was no longer there. He thought to himself that Li might have run away out of fear. Just then, the kobold swung at Seong, but fortunately, Yizal was able to block the attack and assist him. However, as she tried to warn Seong to be more careful, she accidentally slipped and fell to the ground. In that precarious moment, the kobold prepared to deliver a powerful strike toward Yizal. Believing it was all over for her, Yizal braced for impact. But at that instant, Li rushed in from behind, hurling an unusual-looking fruit into the air. He deftly sliced the fruit, releasing its juice onto his sword just as he swung at the kobold. The blade connected, dealing massive damage and instantly killing the creature. In that moment, a notification from the system appeared, confirming to Li that he had successfully eliminated a level 6 kobold. Both Seong and Yizal were taken aback to see that Li had managed to kill the kobold with a single slash of his sword. Li smiled, realizing that he had discovered something important. While the bugs feasted on the fruits growing on the trees, the kobolds had left the fruits untouched. This struck Li as odd. Curious, he opened his guidebook to learn more about the fruit he had just used. To his surprise, he discovered it was a poison apple. The guidebook also noted that kobolds were particularly vulnerable to poison. It advised Li to gather these fruits from the mountains and use them strategically in his battles against the kobolds. Li realized that the key to completing the level 1 mission was to use the fruits against the kobolds. Seong, irritated by the outcome, watched silently. Meanwhile, Li approached Yizal, offering his hand and asking if she was okay. She assured him that she was fine and thanked him for his help. Li then explained to Yizal that he hadn't expected another kobold to be drawn there due to the aggro. He added that it would have been dangerous if he had arrived just a moment later. Yizal told Li that, regardless, he had arrived just in time to help her, and she was grateful for his assistance in such a dangerous situation. She then asked him where he had disappeared to. Before Li could respond, Seong interrupted, angrily labeling Li a free rider. He accused Li of hiding in a corner during the danger and only swooping in to steal the final hit on the kobold after Seong had already landed several blows. Li was bewildered by Seong's accusations, while Seong continued to berate him, claiming that Li had acted unethically by stealing the stat points that rightfully belonged to him for defeating the kobold. Seong then turned and walked away, asserting that, as a higher-level player, he would be the bigger person and let the matter slide. Li, however, couldn't help but think Seong was delusional. Without his intervention, Seong would have found himself in serious trouble or worse against the kobold. Seeing Seong's behavior, Li thought to himself that Seong clearly couldn't read the room, and he was only making things harder for himself with this attitude. Moments later, in the kobold village, Seong was exerting himself fully in an attempt to defeat the kobolds, but it was futile. He was dealing far too little damage to make any significant impact on the monsters. As the kobolds continued to inflict damage on Seong, he thought to himself that the monsters seemed relentless. Meanwhile, he observed Li and Yizal effortlessly defeating the creatures, their movements fluid and confident. Seong couldn't help but wonder how they managed to take down the monsters so easily while he struggled and took a beating. With each passing moment, as he endured more blows from the kobolds, Seong's injuries worsened, and he eventually found himself on the ground, crying and begging for help. Overwhelmed by the pain and desperation, he pleaded for someone to rescue him from this dire situation, unable to endure it any longer. Just then, as Seong was crying, he felt the relentless beating stop. Looking up, he saw that the kobolds that had been attacking him were now dead, slain by Li and Yizal. Li approached Seong, extended his hand, and said with a grin that he had taken over the coattail ride in Seong's place for a little while. He then playfully asked Seong how the ride was now that he was in charge. Seong's face lit up with happiness, and he exclaimed loudly, calling Lee his big brother, overwhelmed with joy that Lee had saved him from the kobolds. Both Lee and Yizal were taken aback by Seong's sudden change in attitude, and at that moment, the system notification appeared, announcing that they had successfully cleared the mission. A few moments later, the three of them returned to the lobby. As Seong reflected on his earlier actions, he regretted having bowed to Lee and declared that he would serve him from that point on. It irked him to think that he had referred to a newbie like Lee as Sir. Seong glanced at Lee with irritation, especially since Lee was only level 2 while he had already reached level 8, and yet, it was Seong who had been saved by him. He worried about the consequences if this information got out, but Seong, determined to uphold his pride as a man, resolved not to back down from his earlier words. His irritation began to resurface once again. Lee, meanwhile, observed Seong making strange faces and thought that he might need to go to the restroom. Yizal, scanning her surroundings, noticed that the lobby was empty, leading her to conclude that they might be the first ones to complete the mission. Lee chimed in, noting that it seemed they had indeed finished the mission faster than anyone else, thanks to their fortunate discovery of the kobolds' weakness, which had allowed them to defeat the monsters with ease. Seong, taken aback, couldn't believe that they were in first place and had finished the mission ahead of everyone else. At that moment, Yizal told Lee that it wasn't luck but rather his keen observational skills that had allowed them to be the first to complete the mission. She added that she would never have thought to use the poison from the fruits against the kobolds. Lee acknowledged this, saying that without Yisol's support, it would have been much harder for him to handle the monsters. As he spoke, other groups of players began emerging from the gate after completing their missions. Lee remarked to the two of them that it looked like the other parties were returning as well. He wondered if those parties belonged to Junsung and Junho and speculated that they might have discovered the poisonous apples, too. Lee felt a bit of concern, hoping that the other parties would make it back to the lobby safely. At that moment, one player announced that another party had made it back alive and successfully completed the mission. As they observed the returning players, Yizal asked about the third member of their party, noting that only 2 had emerged from the gate. The player, tears in their eyes, responded that those 2 were the only ones who had made it out alive. Just then, an announcement echoed through the lobby, declaring that the first level mission had been completed by all the parties. Upon hearing this, Yizal shouted that there was still someone unaccounted for from the gate. The announcement was repeated, confirming that a total of 6 parties had returned alive, while 8 players had failed to make it back. Lee was shocked upon hearing this announcement. He had anticipated that it would be difficult for everyone to return alive, but he was taken aback to learn that 8 people had already perished in the first level. Lee wondered how many more would die before they reached the top. The announcement continued, stating that the calculation for the level 1 mission would now begin and that the parties who had returned whole, as well as those who had cleared the first level first, would each receive 100 gold. At that moment, Lee realized he had earned 2,000 gold from both bonuses. Although this amount was somewhat lacking compared to the tutorial rewards, gold represented a form of insurance for Lee's future survival, and he felt a sense of satisfaction at receiving it. At that moment, Lee thought to himself that he needed to save as much gold as possible. While he was deep in thought, he heard a voice asking which group had been the first to complete the mission. Lee realized he had to reveal this information, especially since the party that returned second already knew that he and his team had been the first. However, just as he was about to speak up, Seong stepped forward and proudly announced that their team had completed the level 1 mission first. Seong boasted that it was an obvious outcome, claiming that he and his team had always expected to be the frontrunners. He then told the other players not to be disheartened by their loss. Everyone was taken aback to learn that Seong's party had been the first to complete the mission. Seong, noticing their astonishment, questioned why they couldn't believe it and implied they were just jealous for not securing first place. The others clarified that their disbelief wasn't rooted in jealousy but rather in the fact that Lee, who was only level 2, was part of their team. They looked at Lee with disdain, pointing out that he had received 2,000 gold for essentially doing nothing, warning him not to get too carried away. As the crowd continued to criticize him, Lee began to feel increasingly bothered by their remarks. Just as Yizal was about to speak up and explain that their victory was thanks to Lee, he quickly interrupted her, assuring her it was fine. He pointed out that the others wouldn't listen to their explanation anyway. Instead, Lee resolved to demonstrate his worth through actions, believing that mere words wouldn't convince them. At that moment, Junsung stepped in, urging everyone to calm down and reminding them that they needed to prioritize their survival over petty arguments. At that moment, Kim Junsung, already at level 8 and an archer, was one of the highest level players in the region. Seo Junho, also level 8 but a combat swordsman, echoed Junsung's sentiment, emphasizing the importance of moving forward. He added that they must continue to push on in honor of those who had lost their lives. Everyone felt motivated by Junsung and Junho's words, rallying together as they shouted to shake off their despair and prepare for the challenges ahead. Just then, the blue flames illuminating the lobby flickered out, replaced by ominous red flames. An announcement echoed through the area, warning everyone present of an impending danger. Confusion swept over the crowd as they tried to grasp what was happening. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.